A father's promise. The evening sun cast golden rays through the spacious windows of the Wallace family's home, bathing the room in a gentle, fading light. 9-year-old Chloe Wallace lay curled up on the plush sofa, her face pale and contorted with pain. Usually the spark of their household, Chloe now looked subdued, her energy faded. Her dark, curly hair clung damply to her forehead as her breathing came in shallow, tired breaths. "Sweetheart, try just a sip of this ginger tea," Leah, her mother, encouraged, her hand gentle as she brushed the hair from Chloe's face. Chloe shook her head, wincing. "It hurts too much, Mom." Her voice was barely a whisper, and the discomfort in her stomach twisted tighter. Across the room, Alexander Wallace, Chloe's father, checked his watch again, a silent countdown ticking in his mind. He was a man used to action, to solutions, and to ensuring everything under his influence ran smoothly. As one of the city's most influential figures and a self-made billionaire, Alexander was used to solving problems with a single phone call. But tonight, the sight of his little girl's face drawn in pain left him feeling helpless. The medication should have kicked in by now, he murmured to Leah, his voice laced with frustration. The pills their family doctor prescribed hadn't relieved her symptoms, and he hated watching Chloe suffer. Leah looked down at their daughter, her heart tightening. Maybe we should try a heating pad again, or a few more sips of water. But Chloe only shook her head, her hands clenched around her stomach, her eyes shut tight. Alexander's jaw tensed. They had tried everything. The medicine, gentle massages, warm compresses, yet Chloe's pain seemed only to intensify. "I don't like this," he said quietly to Leah, stepping away from Chloe's earshot. "It's been days, and she's not getting better. This isn't just a stomach bug." Leah nodded, worry filling her gaze. "Maybe it's time to go to the hospital." Without hesitation, Alexander pulled out his phone. "I'll make the call," he replied firmly, his mind made up. Metropolitan Hospital was the city's most prestigious, and Alexander trusted that there, they'd find the answers. He bent down to Chloe's side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, we're going to see some special doctors tomorrow. They're going to help you feel better, I promise." Chloe's tired eyes blinked open, meeting his. "Promise." Alexander squeezed her hand. "Promise." The next morning, Alexander and Leah helped Chloe out of the car and into the grand lobby of Metropolitan Hospital. The gleaming marble floors and towering columns created an air of importance. Alexander's usual confidence remained tempered by his worry as he walked with Leah and their daughter toward the reception. "Mr. Wallace," the receptionist greeted, clearly recognizing him. "Dr. Winston has been notified of your arrival." Within moments, they were ushered into a private waiting room reserved for high-profile patients. Despite the luxurious leather chairs and serene water feature, Chloe shifted restlessly in her seat, her small hand clinging to Leah's as her stomach pain grew worse. A nurse in crisp scrubs appeared, her smile warm. "Dr. Winston will see you now." They were led through winding hallways to a spacious office where Dr. Michael Winston sat behind an imposing desk, his white coat pristine and his silver hair neatly combed. The doctor's polite smile faded quickly as he looked down at his files, his gaze barely landing on Chloe before he addressed Alexander. "Mr. Wallace, good morning," Dr. Winston greeted, offering his hand. His tone was cordial but detached, his attention mostly on Alexander and Leah. "This is our daughter, Chloe," Alexander said, gesturing to the little girl who clutched her mother's hand. Dr. Winston nodded, glancing only briefly at Chloe. "I understand she's experiencing some abdominal discomfort. Mr. Wallace, would you mind describing her symptoms?" Alexander exchanged a quick glance with Leah, sensing the doctor's focus was more on them than on Chloe. Leah leaned down, encouraging her daughter. "Chloe, can you tell Dr. Winston where it hurts?" Chloe hesitated, then pressed a trembling hand to her lower right side. "It hurts here, especially when I try to eat." Dr. Winston's brows furrowed, and his gaze shifted back to his files. "Likely a dietary sensitivity," he muttered, his tone more focused on his notepad than on Chloe. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. "Dr. Winston, we need to know what's wrong and why her pain isn't easing. We've tried everything." Dr. Winston sighed, scribbling a few notes. "Well, without jumping to conclusions, I'd recommend a few tests. But to be candid, I'm skeptical this is more than a simple dietary or psychological issue." He looked back at Alexander and Leah, almost dismissively, as though Chloe were exaggerating her symptoms. Leah's protective instincts flared. "Doctor, she's been in intense pain. This isn't just about food." The doctor shrugged, unfazed. "In my experience, these cases often resolve on their own. Children sometimes exaggerate symptoms for attention. We'll do the tests, but I wouldn't expect anything out of the ordinary." His words hit like a slap, and Chloe's grip on her mother's hand tightened. Tears pricked her eyes as she shrank back, feeling small and overlooked. "Dr. Winston," Alexander said, his voice tight, "my daughter deserves to be heard." Dr. Winston's indifferent glance landed on Chloe, a flicker of impatience passing over his features. "We'll begin with standard tests," he replied dismissively, "though I assure you it's likely nothing." With that, he turned to call for a nurse, completely oblivious to the pain and frustration he'd left in the room. After the examination, after several hours of uncomfortable tests, Chloe looked exhausted, her small face pale as she clung to Leah's hand. Alexander was pacing, his anger simmering as he watched his daughter endure test after test, without so much as a comforting word from Dr. Winston or his team. Back in the examination room, Dr. Winston reappeared, his expression still distant. "The tests will take a day or two to process," he informed them. "In the meantime, you can take her home. I doubt we'll find anything unusual, but I'll keep you informed." His words struck a nerve. "We're not looking for guesses," Alexander said, his voice cold. "We're looking for someone who takes my daughter's pain seriously." Dr. Winston's eyebrow raised, a hint of arrogance in his gaze. "Mr. Wallace, if you don't trust my expertise, perhaps you'd be more comfortable with another opinion." Without another word, he walked out, leaving Alexander and Leah stunned and fuming. As they left the hospital, Alexander took Chloe's hand gently. He looked down at her, his determination renewed. "Sweetheart, we'll get answers, and we'll find someone who truly cares." His resolve hardened as he realized that this was not over. Chloe deserved respect, kindness, and above all, the attention of a compassionate doctor. He would make sure she got it, even if it meant reshaping the hospital's practices and reputation altogether. A father's determination. Back at home, Alexander couldn't shake the cold dismissal they had received from Dr. Winston. His daughter, Chloe, had spent the night in discomfort and tears, and the doctor's arrogant disregard gnawed at him. He could still see the look on Chloe's face as she curled up on the hospital bed, feeling ignored and dismissed. That expression, a mixture of pain, hurt, and confusion, left Alexander both furious and heartbroken. The following morning, he sat in his home office, phone in hand, scrolling through his contacts. As the CEO of Wallace Global Industries, Alexander was no stranger to people bowing to his authority. Yet, for the first time, he felt powerless, as though his wealth and influence meant nothing when it came to protecting his daughter. But he wasn't one to back down. He had always believed that if you wanted something done right, you had to do it yourself. And if the hospital was going to ignore Chloe's pain, he would make sure someone else didn't. Just then, Leah entered the office, her expression weary. She'd stayed up all night with Chloe, who had barely slept, her pain refusing to subside. "We can't keep doing this, Alex," she said softly, her voice tinged with frustration and worry. "Our daughter's suffering, and that doctor, he just brushed her aside as if she was exaggerating." Alexander looked up, his face set in determination. "I know, and I'm done with him. I called a few people early this morning. I'm arranging for a second opinion with Dr. Samantha Lynn. She's one of the top pediatric specialists in the country. We're going to get to the bottom of this." Leah sighed, a glimmer of relief crossing her face. "Thank you, Alex. I just want her to feel better. It's been days, and it's as if no one's taking her seriously." Alexander clenched his jaw. "They will now. I'll make sure of it." At Dr. Lynn's clinic. The next afternoon, Alexander and Leah brought Chloe to Dr. Lynn's private clinic. The difference was apparent the moment they walked in. The clinic was bright, colorful, and filled with cheerful, child-friendly decor. Chloe's eyes brightened a little as she took in the murals of cartoon animals and the play area filled with toys and books. A kind-looking nurse greeted them with a warm smile, bending down to Chloe's level. "Hi there, Chloe. I hear you've got a bit of a tummy ache. Don't worry, Dr. Lynn is going to take great care of you." Chloe nodded shyly, still clutching her mother's hand, but the welcoming environment seemed to put her at ease. A few minutes later, Dr. Samantha Lynn appeared. She was a petite woman in her mid-40s with a kind face and warm eyes. She approached Chloe with a gentle smile and an air of calm. "Hello, Chloe," Dr. Lynn said, sitting down in front of her. "I heard you've been having a rough time with your tummy. Do you feel up to telling me what's going on?" Chloe nodded slowly. "It hurts a lot. Right here." She pointed to her lower right side, her voice barely a whisper. "And sometimes I feel sick when I eat." Dr. Lynn listened intently, nodding with empathy and understanding. "Thank you for telling me, Chloe. I know it's not easy to talk about something that's hurting you so much, but I'm here to help, and we're going to figure this out together, okay?" Chloe gave a small nod, her trust in Dr. Lynn growing with each moment. Dr. Lynn turned to Alexander and Leah. "I'll start with a gentle physical examination, and then we'll run some tests. But I want to assure you both, I'll be with Chloe every step of the way, and I'll explain everything so that she doesn't feel scared or alone." Leah's eyes softened with relief, and she squeezed Alexander's hand. For the first time in days, it felt like they were making progress. Troubling discoveries. By late afternoon, Dr. Lynn had completed a thorough examination and preliminary tests. Afterward, she met with Alexander and Leah privately in her office, while Chloe rested in a small lounge area with a nurse. Dr. Lynn's expression was serious as she looked over the medical reports. "I don't want to alarm you, but I'm seeing some early signs of a potential issue with her appendix," she began cautiously. "It's subtle, and it wouldn't be unusual for someone to overlook these symptoms, but Chloe's discomfort and pain seemed consistent with early appendicitis." Alexander's face darkened. "Are you telling me this could have been missed?" His mind immediately jumped back to Dr. Winston's callous dismissal. Dr. Lynn hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Unfortunately, yes. Chloe's symptoms could easily be overlooked, especially if they were attributed to dietary causes or stress. But the important thing now is that we have her here, and we're going to address it promptly." Leah's hands covered her mouth in horror. Days of pain. And no one caught this. Dr. Lynn nodded sympathetically. "It happens more than you'd think, unfortunately. But I want you both to know that Chloe is in good hands now. I'll be arranging a few more detailed scans to confirm, and if necessary, we'll move quickly to prevent any complications." The moment of realization. Once they returned home that evening, Alexander couldn't rest. His mind raced with frustration over the misdiagnosis. Dr. Winston had ignored Chloe's symptoms, dismissing her pain as insignificant and practically shoving them out of his office. He treated his daughter like she was exaggerating, like she wasn't worthy of his time. Sitting in his home office, Alexander picked up his phone and made a call to his attorney. "Frank, I need you to look into something for me. Dr. Michael Winston at Metropolitan Hospital. I want every detail on his practice, every complaint, every malpractice case. I want to know if he's done this before." There was a pause, and then Frank responded, "Absolutely, Alex. I'll get on it right away." Alexander hung up, feeling a flicker of vindication. If Dr. Winston had a history of negligence, Alexander would make sure he was held accountable, not just for Chloe, but for every patient he'd ever dismissed. That night, Alexander sat by Chloe's bedside, gently stroking her hair as she finally drifted off to sleep, her pain momentarily subdued by medication. Leah watched from the doorway, sensing the storm brewing within her husband. She knew him well enough to see that he was planning something. "You're going to make him pay for this, aren't you?" she asked softly, stepping into the room and resting a hand on his shoulder. Alexander's gaze didn't waver from Chloe's sleeping face. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect her," he replied, his voice low and resolute. "And I'll make sure no other child suffers the way she has because of his arrogance." Leah nodded, understanding the depth of his resolve. "Just don't let this consume you, Alex. Our priority is Chloe. That doctor will get what he deserves, but Chloe needs you focused and present." Alexander took her hand, his gaze softening for a moment. "I promise. But I won't let him walk away from this, Leah. He'll remember Chloe's name for the rest of his life." The search for justice. The following week, after Chloe's successful diagnosis and treatment, Alexander received a call from Frank with an update on Dr. Winston. The attorney's voice was filled with urgency. "Alex, you won't believe this. Winston has been under review before for complaints about his behavior and attitude toward minority patients, especially children." Alexander's grip tightened on the phone. "And yet he's still practicing. It seems he's been protected by the hospital administration. They've buried complaints, likely because he brings in high-profile patients. But you have enough influence to bring all of this to light." Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you, Frank. We're going to bring this to the board's attention. Let's make sure Dr. Winston's treatment of Chloe is the last time he dismisses a patient's pain." He hung up, determination burning in his chest. This was no longer just about Chloe. It was about ensuring no other family had to endure what they had. Alexander was going to make certain that the entire hospital board knew the full extent of Dr. Winston's negligence and lack of empathy. And if they failed to act, he'd use every bit of his wealth and influence to expose the hospital's corrupt protection of him, unmasking the system. The morning sun filtered through the office windows as Alexander stood by his desk, phone in hand, waiting for the call to connect. His expression was resolute, his jaw set with a determination that only intensified as he replayed Chloe's experience at the hospital in his mind. Today, he would make sure the board of Metropolitan Hospital heard everything. After what felt like an eternity, a calm, professional voice answered. "This is Meredith Jensen, head of Metropolitan Hospital's board of directors. How can I assist you?" Alexander didn't waste a second. "Ms. Jensen, my name is Alexander Wallace. My daughter, Chloe, was recently under the care of Dr. Michael Winston. I have significant concerns regarding his treatment of her and the general standards of your hospital." There was a pause on the other end, but he could sense her listening attentively. "Mr. Wallace, thank you for bringing this to our attention. Can you tell me more about the incident?" He took a deep breath, each word measured and direct. "My daughter was in severe pain for days, yet Dr. Winston barely acknowledged her symptoms. He dismissed her with condescension and even insinuated that her condition was due to cultural habits, which I find deeply offensive. Chloe's pain was real, severe enough to require urgent care, but Dr. Winston acted as though she was exaggerating. His arrogance and prejudice put my daughter at risk." Ms. Jensen's silence weighed heavily before she finally replied. "That sounds extremely concerning, Mr. Wallace. We have protocols in place to handle complaints, and I assure you, they will be thoroughly investigated." "Ms. Jensen," Alexander's voice sharpened, "this is beyond a routine complaint. I have uncovered records showing Dr. Winston has a history of dismissive and negligent treatment of minority patients. If your hospital knowingly shields such behavior, you may be facing much more than an internal investigation." Ms. Jensen's tone shifted, her professionalism tinged with unease. "I understand, Mr. Wallace. I will personally see to it that this case receives the highest level of scrutiny. The hospital board will review the complaint immediately." Satisfied, for the moment, Alexander hung up. He knew Ms. Jensen would feel compelled to act quickly. His status and influence alone would make sure of that. But he was far from done. The unseen damage. While Alexander waged his battle against the hospital, Chloe was slowly beginning to recover. Dr. Lin's compassionate care had made a world of difference, and her diagnosis of early appendicitis proved accurate. Chloe's appendix had been removed in time, and her pain was finally fading. Yet there was a lingering sadness in her eyes, one that even her parents couldn't ignore. One evening, as she sat on the living room couch, her gaze fixed on a book she wasn't reading, Leah sat down beside her, gently taking Chloe's hand. "Sweetheart, are you feeling okay?" Chloe shrugged, her voice barely a whisper. "I just don't understand why Dr. Winston was so mean to me. I didn't do anything wrong." Leah's heart broke as she pulled Chloe into a gentle hug. "You didn't do anything wrong, Chloe. Some people are just not as kind as they should be. But you're brave and you handled yourself so well. I'm so proud of you." Chloe nodded, but her brows knitted with worry. "Daddy's really mad, isn't he?" Leah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he is. But he's doing everything he can to make sure no one else has to go through what you did. He's going to make it right." Chloe's gaze softened as she looked down at her hands. She didn't fully understand what her father was doing, but knowing he was fighting for her made her feel a little safer. And that was all she needed for now. The boardroom showdown. A few days later, Alexander received an invitation to present his complaint in person before the hospital board. It was unusual, but Ms. Jensen insisted, stating it was critical that the board members fully understood the severity of the issue. Alexander agreed. If they wanted to hear directly from him, he'd make sure they heard everything. The boardroom at Metropolitan Hospital was a grand space, with polished wood walls and a long gleaming table at its center. Around it sat members of the hospital's elite, board members, administrators, and high-ranking medical professionals. Ms. Jensen introduced herself in person, then gestured to the seat at the head of the table. "Mr. Wallace, thank you for joining us," she began, her expression serious but courteous. "We've reviewed your written complaint, but we believe hearing directly from you will help us understand the full extent of your concerns." Alexander surveyed the faces around him before he began. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," he started, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "As I'm sure you know, my daughter, Chloe, was seen by Dr. Winston a few days ago. She was suffering from severe stomach pain. I trusted that she would receive the best care here, but instead she was ignored, dismissed, and treated with arrogance. Dr. Winston implied that her pain wasn't real, that it was a product of our cultural practices, which he deemed unhealthy." He paused, noting the discomfort on some of the board members' faces. "This isn't just about my daughter," Alexander continued. "Through my own investigation, I discovered that Dr. Winston has a history of similar complaints. Families, especially those from minority backgrounds, have experienced his cold, biased approach firsthand. He disregards symptoms, dismisses concerns, and treats patients as if they're wasting his time. And yet he's still here, shielded by this institution." A murmur of unease spread through the board members, and Ms. Jensen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Alexander's voice grew colder. "As a parent, I will not allow anyone to treat my daughter as less than she is. And as someone with the means to act, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to bring this to light. If this hospital won't take immediate action to ensure Dr. Winston is held accountable, I'll make sure the public knows every detail of this case." The silence in the room was palpable. Alexander could see the unease etched on their faces, their reluctance to face the consequences of ignoring his words. Finally, Ms. Jensen spoke, her tone now more conciliatory. "Mr. Wallace, we understand your frustration, and your concerns are valid. The board will review Dr. Winston's conduct and consider the appropriate actions to address this issue." Alexander's gaze was unwavering. Appropriate actions aren't enough. I expect to see immediate changes in your policies, your staff's training, and your hiring practices. This hospital should be a place of healing, not a place where people like my daughter feel unseen and unheard." He rose, leaving them in silence, his message delivered. The media's attention. Later that afternoon, Alexander sat with Frank in his office, his expression dark but focused. The media had started to take notice of his actions, and reporters were beginning to sniff around for details. "If the board drags its feet, I want every news outlet in the city to know about this," Alexander instructed Frank. "They're not just going to sweep this under the rug." Frank nodded. "The media's already buzzing. They're interested in the story. A powerful family standing up against medical negligence. It'll make headlines if it comes to that." Alexander's lips thinned. "Good. I don't want them to forget this, even after we've moved on. If they fail to act, they'll be held accountable by the public." An unexpected ally. That evening, Alexander received an unexpected call from Dr. Samantha Lynn, Chloe's new doctor. She sounded both earnest and hesitant as she spoke. "Mr. Wallace, I wanted to reach out to thank you," she began. "Your stand against Dr. Winston is resonating with a lot of us in the medical community. Many of us have been frustrated with how these issues get ignored or buried. Your actions are giving hope to people who felt powerless for too long." Alexander was surprised but heartened. "Thank you, Dr. Lynn. It's good to know there are doctors like you who actually care about their patients." "There's something else," Dr. Lynn added, her tone cautious. "I shouldn't be saying this, but there are other staff members who have experienced similar treatment from Dr. Winston. Nurses, residents. They are treated just as poorly as patients. It's a toxic atmosphere, but until now, no one's dared to speak up. Your actions might be the push they need to come forward." Alexander's resolve only deepened. "Dr. Lynn, if there's anything I can do to support them, let me know. No one should have to work under someone like that." After he hung up, Alexander sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of his mission settle on him. This was no longer just about Chloe's treatment. He was uncovering something much deeper, a system that allowed negligence and arrogance to thrive unchecked. And now he was determined to shine a light on it for everyone to see. A wave of change. Days passed, but the tension surrounding Metropolitan Hospital only grew. Alexander's public statement had struck a nerve, and news of the Wallace family's experience began to spread throughout the city. The media was ablaze with the story of Chloe's mistreatment, and Alexander's unwavering resolve to expose the negligence within the healthcare system sparked a wave of public outrage. Yet, within the walls of the hospital, the staff was divided. In the doctor's lounge, discussions grew heated as some supported Dr. Winston, while others saw Alexander's actions as the push the hospital had long needed. Among those most affected were the younger nurses and residents who had often borne the brunt of Dr. Winston's dismissive behavior. One such resident, Sarah Ortiz, had just finished her shift and was seated at a table with her colleagues, nervously glancing over her shoulder before speaking. "I know we're not supposed to talk about these things," she said in a low voice. "But the truth is, Dr. Winston has always treated patients like they're beneath him, especially those from minority backgrounds. And now, thanks to Mr. Wallace, people are actually listening." The nurses around her nodded, exchanging grim looks. One of them, a seasoned nurse named Leela, sighed heavily. "I've been here for 15 years, and I've seen it all. But I've never seen anyone willing to take a stand like Mr. Wallace. Usually, people just stay silent and hope it doesn't get worse." A young nurse named Ethan, who had recently witnessed Dr. Winston belittling a patient, joined in. "It's as if he thinks his position makes him untouchable. I know we're just supposed to follow orders, but I can't pretend this is normal anymore. Maybe it's time we said something too." The small group exchanged glances, a shared resolve growing stronger among them. They knew that speaking out could risk their careers, yet the thought of staying silent weighed even heavier. One by one, They agreed to join together and provide statements to the board, detailing their experiences with Dr. Winston's behavior. Alexander's growing network. Back in his office, Alexander was on the phone with Frank, his attorney, as they discussed the recent developments. "Alex, I've got more news," Frank said, his voice firm. "Several nurses and residents have reached out to us. They're willing to testify about Dr. Winston's behavior and even share written statements documenting the incidents they've witnessed. It seems you've inspired a lot of people." Alexander felt a sense of vindication but remained focused. "Good. The board needs to know this isn't an isolated case. Dr. Winston has been getting away with this for too long, and the hospital has been complicit. I'm not backing down until they take meaningful action." A pause lingered on the other end of the line before Frank spoke again. "You know, if we take this to court, it could lead to a major case of medical negligence and discrimination. You'd be pushing against an institution, Alex. Are you ready for that?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "I don't care how long it takes or what it costs. I'm ready for whatever comes. If they won't protect their patients, I will." After the call, Alexander reached out to several influential contacts in the media and the healthcare sector. He wanted to make sure that Chloe's story didn't fade into the background, but rather continued to drive momentum for change. His network was powerful, and he would use every connection he had to shine a spotlight on the hospital's failures. The board's secret meeting. Meanwhile, within Metropolitan Hospital, the board members were holding a closed-door meeting. Ms. Jensen stood at the head of the table, her hands clasped tightly as she addressed the concerned and apprehensive faces around her. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you're all aware, Mr. Wallace's complaint has turned into a full-blown scandal. The media is pressing us for statements, and several staff members have now come forward with their own accounts of Dr. Winston's behavior," she said, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic tremor. "Our reputation, and frankly, our jobs, are on the line." An older board member, Dr. Foster, cleared his throat. "We've always known Dr. Winston could be difficult, but he brings in a significant amount of revenue from high-profile clients. Are we really willing to jeopardize that over a few complaints?" Another board member, a younger man named Thomas Hale, shook his head. "We can't ignore this, Dr. Foster. There are too many witnesses, and Mr. Wallace's reach is significant. If we don't take action, we risk more than just our reputation. We could be facing lawsuits." Ms. Jensen nodded. "I agree. We can't afford to appear indifferent to such serious allegations. I propose we suspend Dr. Winston while we conduct a thorough investigation." The room fell silent. Dr. Foster's face turned red with indignation, but he stayed quiet. The weight of the decision was apparent to everyone in the room. Ms. Jensen continued, "We need to demonstrate to the public, our patients, and our staff that we're committed to accountability and integrity. I'll inform Dr. Winston of his suspension effective immediately." The meeting concluded with murmurs of uncertainty, and Ms. Jensen left the boardroom, her face pale but resolved. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the hospital, one that demanded transparency and justice. Dr. Winston's reaction. Dr. Winston sat in his office, staring at the official letter of suspension with a mixture of disbelief and fury. His carefully curated image of professionalism and respect was crumbling before his eyes. He clenched his fists, his mind racing through possible ways to regain control. "How dare they?" he muttered under his breath, his anger simmering. "They wouldn't dare challenge me if it weren't for Wallace." In his mind, Alexander Wallace was nothing more than a meddlesome parent with money to throw around. Dr. Winston was too proud to acknowledge that his behavior had consequences, too arrogant to consider that his actions were finally catching up to him. As he paced around his office, his thoughts shifted to damage control. He made a few calls to colleagues and influential friends, hoping they would rally to his defense. But one by one, they offered him only cautious sympathy, unwilling to risk their own reputations by supporting him publicly. His options were running out. Dr. Winston's career and his pride were on the line, and he wasn't about to go down without a fight. Chloe's healing and resolve. Back at the Wallace residence, Chloe was slowly beginning to return to her cheerful self. Her physical recovery from the surgery was progressing well, and her parents noticed the familiar spark gradually returning to her eyes. But there was a new maturity in her, a quiet resilience that had emerged from her ordeal. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Chloe looked up at her father with an inquisitive expression. "Daddy," she began hesitantly, "are you fighting for me?" Alexander knelt down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm fighting for you, and for everyone who deserves to be treated with respect. What happened to you was wrong, and I won't let it happen again to anyone else." Chloe seemed to think about this for a moment before she nodded, her gaze firm. "I want to help too. I don't want other kids to feel like they're not being heard." Alexander's heart swelled with pride as he looked at his daughter. Despite everything she had gone through, Chloe's spirit remained unbroken, her desire to make a difference as fierce as his own. "Then we'll do this together," he replied with a smile. "We'll make sure everyone knows your story, and we'll show them what it means to stand up for what's right." Chloe smiled, feeling a sense of strength and purpose that carried her through the rest of her recovery. She knew that her father was fighting for her, but now she wanted to be part of that fight too. Public support and backlash. Over the next few days, Chloe's story continued to spread, capturing the hearts of people across the city and even beyond. Social media buzzed with messages of support for the Wallace family, and people began sharing their own stories of mistreatment and neglect within the healthcare system. With the growing attention, Alexander received countless letters and messages from families who had experienced similar hardships. Some messages were from parents who had lost loved ones due to negligence, while others were from healthcare workers who faced discrimination. Alexander read every message, each one strengthening his resolve. However, not everyone was pleased with the attention. Some of Dr. Winston's supporters accused Alexander of waging a personal vendetta, claiming he was overreacting. But Alexander was undeterred. He knew that the truth would prevail, and he wasn't about to let a few dissenting voices shake his conviction. A community united. Inspired by Alexander's campaign, community leaders and activists began organizing events and rallies in support of better healthcare policies. Parents, teachers, and local officials joined together, demanding accountability from hospitals and healthcare providers. They called for reform, for transparency, and for a system that put patients first. At one of these rallies, Alexander spoke to a crowd, sharing Chloe's story and expressing his hope for a future where no child would have to endure what she had. Standing beside him was Chloe herself, holding his hand as she looked out at the crowd, her small face filled with determination. "My daughter taught me the importance of speaking up," Alexander said, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "And now I'm here to make sure her voice, and all of yours, are heard." The crowd erupted into applause, and as Chloe looked up at her father, she knew they were creating something powerful. Together, they were part of a movement that was bigger than any of them, a movement to change the system and ensure justice for all. Shattering the illusion. The growing storm around Metropolitan Hospital wasn't just contained to the boardrooms or media coverage anymore. It had spread through every hallway, every patient room, and every conversation in the building. Alexander's relentless pursuit of justice for Chloe had forced a reckoning, one that left no corner of the institution untouched. Nurses whispered in the break rooms about Dr. Winston's suspension, speculating on what might happen next. Some spoke of him with sympathy, claiming he'd always been a strict but skilled doctor. But the majority saw his absence as a relief, a chance to breathe without the shadow of his intimidating presence. Younger staff members, in particular, felt as though a weight had been lifted, a weight they'd carried in silence for far too long. One such staff member, Sarah Ortiz, the young resident who had been part of the initial group to speak out, felt a mixture of relief and guilt. While she was glad Dr. Winston had been held accountable, She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling of being part of a movement that had torn through the hospital like a wildfire. And yet, each time she doubted herself, she thought of Chloe Wallace, the small girl who'd been brave enough to confront her own pain in front of an unfeeling doctor. On her lunch break, Sarah found herself sitting beside Ethan, the young nurse who'd also joined the efforts to reform the hospital. He looked at her with a quiet resolve as he stirred his coffee. "Do you think it's enough?" he asked. "Suspending Winston, do you think it'll actually change anything?" Sarah sighed, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "I don't know. I want to believe it will, but part of me worries the hospital might just sweep everything under the rug once the media moves on." Ethan nodded, sharing her concern. "It's hard to change a place that's built on keeping everything hidden. But if enough of us keep pushing, maybe they'll finally listen." The two of them sat in silence, each lost in thought. They'd been part of something that felt bigger than themselves, something that resonated through every floor of the hospital. And yet, they knew the fight wasn't over. Dr. Winston's downfall. Dr. Winston's days of influence and pride had unraveled rapidly. Word of his suspension had spread throughout the medical community, and the once revered doctor now found himself increasingly isolated. His colleagues avoided him, unwilling to be seen as sympathetic to someone who would become the face of the hospital scandal. Sitting alone in his luxurious office for perhaps the last time, Dr. Winston looked around at the awards and degrees that adorned his walls, reminders of a career he had believed to be untouchable. He clung to his indignation, convinced he was the victim of a vendetta by an overprotective billionaire father. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had pushed too many boundaries, crossed too many lines. He dismissed patients' concerns, berated staff members, and left countless people feeling belittled and neglected. A knock on his door snapped him out of his thoughts. Ms. Jensen entered, her expression as grim as his. She placed a single sheet of paper on his desk, a formal notice from the hospital board. "It's official, Dr. Winston," she said, her tone clipped. "Your suspension is now a termination. You're no longer welcome here." Dr. Winston's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. In that moment, he realized he was truly alone, his reputation irreparably damaged. The hospital had been his kingdom, and now it was slipping through his fingers. Ms. Jensen turned to leave but paused at the door. "I hope you understand the gravity of what you've done," she added quietly. "This isn't just about you. It's about every patient you disregarded, every life you touched without care. And it's about a little girl who deserved better." With that, she left, leaving Dr. Winston to face the end of his career in silence. Alexander's victory and the road ahead. The news of Dr. Winston's termination made headlines, and the Wallace family received an outpouring of support from the community. Parents who had felt powerless against similar systems finally felt seen. Alexander's campaign had opened a floodgate, revealing a need for reform not just within Metropolitan Hospital, but across the healthcare industry. Sitting in his study that evening, Alexander reflected on everything that had transpired. His actions had brought justice for Chloe, but they'd also stirred up questions about the healthcare system's broader failings. Messages from families, doctors, and advocacy groups had flooded his inbox, and he knew that this victory, while meaningful, was only the beginning. He looked up as Leah entered the room, carrying a newspaper with the headline, "Hospital Reforms Sparked by Wallace Family's Fight." She handed it to him with a soft smile. "You've done something incredible, Alex," she said, sitting beside him. "People are talking about real change now. You made that happen." Alexander placed his hand over hers. "I didn't do it alone. Chloe, you both gave me the strength to keep pushing. And now maybe families like ours won't have to go through this." Leah nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat in a comfortable silence, each feeling the weight of their journey, but also the hope that had come from it. The hospital's transformation. In the weeks that followed, Metropolitan Hospital implemented a series of new protocols aimed at preventing the kinds of issues that had led to Chloe's ordeal. A new oversight committee was formed to review patient complaints, and the hospital began offering sensitivity and empathy training to all staff members. The board took steps to ensure that patients, especially children and those from underrepresented communities, were treated with respect and given a voice. Sarah Ortiz and Ethan, the two staff members who had bravely spoken out, were asked to join a panel advising on patient care improvements. They felt a renewed sense of purpose, as though they were part of building something meaningful. Standing in a brightly lit hallway one day, Ethan turned to Sarah, a hopeful smile on his face. "Can you believe it? We actually made a difference." Sarah laughed softly. "I know. It's surreal. I never thought one little girl's courage would inspire all this change." They both knew it wasn't just Chloe's courage. It was Alexander's unwavering dedication and their own willingness to risk their careers that had created a ripple effect throughout the hospital. Chloe's final checkup. A few weeks later, Chloe returned to the hospital for a routine checkup. This time, the atmosphere felt different. Nurses greeted her warmly, doctors took extra care in explaining every step of her examination, and the entire visit was marked by an air of compassion and respect. Dr. Lin welcomed her with a warm smile, conducting the checkup with her usual kindness. "You're healing beautifully, Chloe," she said, giving her a thumbs up. "And I hear you've been quite the inspiration around here." Chloe beamed, looking up at her father proudly. "My dad said we're making things better for everyone." Dr. Lin nodded, her expression softening. "You are. Because of you, Chloe, a lot of people are being heard and treated with respect, and that's something to be very proud of." As they left the hospital, Alexander knelt down beside Chloe, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You know, sweetheart, what you went through was hard, but you were so brave. Because of you, the hospital is a better place." Chloe hugged her father tightly, feeling a sense of strength and love that had grown throughout their journey. She knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, her family would always stand by her. The long-lasting impact. Over time, the hospital's reforms became a model for other healthcare facilities across the country. Alexander continued to advocate for patient rights, partnering with organizations to push for policy changes at the national level. His determination had turned into a mission, one that he carried forward not just for Chloe, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or ignored. At the Wallace home, Chloe's life gradually returned to normal. She spent her days laughing with friends, playing with her dog, and enjoying her favorite hobbies. But she never forgot the lessons she had learned. Her father's strength, her mother's love, and her own resilience had shown her the power of standing up for what was right. As she grew older, Chloe would come to realize just how profound her impact had been, not just on her family, but on an entire community that had been inspired by her story. And for Alexander, watching his daughter thrive was all the victory he needed. He knew their family had faced something incredibly difficult, but in the end, they had emerged stronger, more united, and more determined than ever to make a difference. The legacy of courage. Months had passed since the Wallace family's battle with Metropolitan Hospital, and life for Chloe and her family had slowly returned to a new normal. Chloe was back in school, her laughter echoing through the halls, her spirit restored. Yet, her experience had left a lasting mark, not just on her, but on her family, the hospital, and the community around them. Alexander's mission to advocate for patient rights had grown into a movement. He had become a prominent figure in healthcare reform, partnering with legal teams, patient rights groups, and hospitals willing to commit to change. What had started as a fight for Chloe had become a crusade for justice and compassion across the entire healthcare system. But it wasn't just Alexander's influence that lingered. It was Chloe's story, her resilience in the face of suffering, that had inspired so many. In the months that followed, the Wallace family received hundreds of letters from families, patients, and healthcare workers who had been moved by Chloe's courage. People shared their stories of injustice, but they also shared their hope, ignited by one small girl's bravery. Chloe's speech. One evening, Alexander received a call inviting Chloe to speak at an event held by a national healthcare advocacy organization. They wanted her to share her story, to help others understand what it meant to be heard and respected as a patient. Chloe hesitated, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness, but Alexander and Leah encouraged her, knowing that her voice could reach people in a way no one else's could. On the day of the event, Chloe stood in front of a large crowd of healthcare professionals, advocates, and families. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back in a neat braid. She took a deep breath, feeling her father's reassuring hand on her shoulder as she stepped up to the podium. "Hi, everyone," Chloe began, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Chloe Wallace, and I want to tell you about my story. When I was 9, I got really sick. My stomach hurt so much, and my parents took me to the hospital because they wanted to help me feel better." She looked around, meeting the eyes of people in the audience who were listening intently. "But when I got there, the doctor didn't listen to me. He said it was my fault, that I didn't understand what was wrong with me. And it made me feel invisible. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, and that I wasn't important enough to be helped." The room was silent, and Chloe took another breath, gathering her courage. "But my dad didn't give up. He fought for me, and he showed me that I mattered, that everyone matters, and that no one should ever feel like they're not worth helping. Because of him, and because of everyone who stood by us, things started to change. And I hope that because of this, no other kid will feel like I did." Chloe stepped back, and the crowd erupted into applause. Alexander felt a lump in his throat as he watched his daughter, her strength radiating out to the people around her. He knew then that this moment, her courage, her voice, was the true legacy of their journey, the Wallace Foundation for Patient Advocacy. In the months that followed, Alexander and Leah took Chloe's experience a step further by establishing the Wallace Foundation for Patient Advocacy. The foundation was dedicated to supporting families facing medical negligence, offering legal assistance, mental health resources, and advocacy training. Its mission was clear: to empower patients, especially those from marginalized communities, and to hold healthcare providers accountable. The foundation worked with hospitals nationwide, developing workshops for medical staff focused on empathy and cultural sensitivity. It funded programs to ensure children were treated with respect and that patients' voices were truly heard. And above all, it aimed to create a legacy that would continue to protect vulnerable patients long after the Wallace's story faded from the news. Through the foundation, Alexander connected with numerous families who had been wronged by the healthcare system, offering them support and resources that hadn't been available to him during Chloe's ordeal. He knew that these efforts would make a real difference, not just for Chloe, but for countless others. Metropolitan Hospital's transformation. Metropolitan Hospital, once a symbol of indifference, had transformed into a model of patient-centered care. The board's decision to fire Dr. Winston had been the first step in a sweeping overhaul of the hospital's culture. New leadership, handpicked for their commitment to integrity and compassion, had been brought in to restore trust and credibility. Ms. Jensen, now head of the hospital's reform initiative, organized quarterly staff training sessions to improve bedside manner and promote respect toward patients from all backgrounds. These sessions included guest speakers from the Wallace Foundation, who shared stories of patients impacted by medical neglect and indifference. Young residents like Sarah Ortiz and Ethan found their voices amplified within the hospital, their insights valued by leadership, and their dedication rewarded. With a newfound confidence, they continued to champion compassionate care, feeling empowered to create a hospital environment they could be proud of. One day, as Sarah walked through the hallways, she noticed a plaque near the children's wing entrance. It read, "In honor of Chloe Wallace, whose courage reminded us of the power of compassion." Below it was a picture of Chloe, smiling brightly, her strength and kindness forever memorialized within the walls that had once ignored her pain. Sarah touched the plaque lightly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Chloe's story had changed everything. more than Sarah had ever imagined possible. Chloe's continued journey. Back at home, Chloe had begun to move on from her experience, though she never forgot the lessons it had taught her. She thrived in school, made new friends, and returned to her favorite hobbies with renewed enthusiasm. But whenever she met someone who shared their own struggles with feeling unheard, she listened intently, offering comfort and understanding that went beyond her years. One day, as she sat on the porch with her father, Chloe looked up at him, her eyes filled with a question she had been waiting to ask. "Daddy," she began, Do you think I can help people too, like you?" Alexander smiled, pulling her close. "You already have, sweetheart. But if you want to keep helping, I know you'll make a difference. You have a gift, Chloe, a way of making people feel like they're seen. Never forget that." Chloe nodded, a quiet determination settling in her heart. She didn't know yet how she would help others, but she knew that someday she would find a way to make a difference just like her father had. A legacy of compassion. Years passed, and the Wallace Foundation continued to grow, impacting lives across the nation. Hospitals that had once been resistant to change were now adopting the Foundation's training programs and protocols. The stories of patients who had been dismissed or neglected became powerful reminders of the importance of empathy in medicine, shaping the future of healthcare. As Chloe grew older, she carried with her the legacy her father had built, a legacy of courage, compassion, and the belief that every voice deserved to be heard. She became an advocate for children's rights, eventually working alongside her father at the foundation, speaking out for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The Wallace's story became more than just a tale of one family's fight for justice. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that change was possible, and a testament to the power of love and resilience. And for Alexander, watching his daughter thrive and make a difference in the world was the greatest victory he could ever have hoped for. Their family had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had emerged stronger, bound together by a shared commitment to make the world a better place. In the end, the Wallace family's journey was about more than just seeking justice. It was about healing, about forgiveness, and about creating a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. A legacy that ensured that everyone, no matter how small or powerless they might feel, would always have a voice. Epilogue. The future of hope. Years later, a young doctor walked into a crowded auditorium to deliver her first speech at a healthcare conference. The room was packed, filled with doctors, nurses, advocates, and students. The doctor's voice was steady, her gaze filled with conviction as she began. "Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Chloe Wallace, and I'm here because I believe that every patient deserves to be heard. My father once told me that compassion is the foundation of healing, and that's why I've dedicated my life to ensuring that every child, every patient, is treated with respect and dignity." As she looked out over the audience, she knew that her father, her mother, and everyone who had been a part of their journey was with her in spirit. She was carrying forward a legacy of love and courage, one that would continue to inspire future generations. And as she finished her speech, the crowd erupted in applause, a standing ovation that echoed through the hall. Chloe knew that she was no longer just the little girl who had once been ignored. She was now a voice for change, a light for others, and a testament to the power of resilience. The legacy of the Wallace family, and Chloe's journey from patient to advocate, would endure for generations, forever changing the face of healthcare, one compassionate act at a time.